This is the choice that we make every day. We weigh the risk and reward and think about whether should we take high risk, high return option, or should we go for a safe bet? And our life builds on these consecutive choices. So we would like to understand how the brain makes such decisions and how the brain weigh consecutive outcomes of after these decisions. So in particular, I would like to understand how we make decisions with the theoretical approaches. And if we consider theory, probably the most famous theory is the expected utility theory. And this theory says that people choose the option that maximize the expected utility. And the expected utility, the capital U, is described by this formula here. And xj is the monetary outcome for the jth outcome indexed by j. And the pj is the probability of observing that outcome. U is a nonlinear function, typically increasing and concave, which convert monetary outcome into utility. And this is a very famous model that explains many features of human decision making. And you can see one fundamental property of the expected utility theory is that the utility function capital U is a linear function of the probability Pj. So because of this property, it predicts that scaling down the reward probabilities of all options by the same factor. This does not change the preference. So for example, imagine that I reduce the probability of getting reward, all outcomes of rewarding options by half. That will reduce the increment of expected utility by half. If I do that for all options, the increment of the utility for all options becomes half, but it doesn't change the relative order of which option is better than others. So the choice would be invariant to such a scale reduction of the probability. However, this is actually not the case if we observe human experimental results. And I will explain it with a famous Allais example. And just to note that in this talk, I focus on options with approximately the same expected outcome, because this is the typical case that can violate expected utility theory. So I just focus on such approximately the same outcome options. And Allais example is described by this table with the two options and the two outcomes for each option. And it's a simple one. The reward probability is described by P, and with the probability 1 minus P, you get 0 reward. And when you receive the reward, you get the outcome E over P, so that the expected value of option 1 is equal to E. And the structure of the option 2 is basically the same. It just has different reward probability Q. And in fact, we assume that Q is slightly less than P. So because of this inequality, this option 1 is more certain option. The rewarding probability is higher. And the option 2 is a more risky option. Reward probability is lower, but the reward amount is higher. So it's more high risk, high return. Okay, and both options have the same expected value of V. So which option do people take? It's known that in the gain domain, when the expected value E is positive, people choose option 1 unless P and Q are very small. So basically in the gain domain, people are risk averse. But now you can scale down the rewarding probability, both P and Q, by the same factor that reduces both P and Q. And if you scale down them with the same factor, people start to choose option 2, which is a more risk-seeking option. So this is a violation of the expected utility theory. And it says that if there is a gambling option, that you get a large outcome with a small probability, people tend to choose gambling option. And it's also known in the loss domain, people typically choose option 2 unless P and Q are small. So in the loss domain, people are basically risk-seeking. But if P and Q are reduced by the same factor, then people start to choose option 1, which is more risk-averse. So that means that if there is a low probability disastrous event, people tend to avoid that option, perhaps by buying insurance. And if you look at compare this risk preference in the gain domain versus in the loss domain, you can notice that the preference is flipped. So this is called the mirror effect. The preference is opposite in the gain and the loss domain. So this is a known property that violates classical utility theory. And there is a theoretical attempt to explain this kind of behavior. And this is the famous prospect theory by Kahneman Tversky. And they introduce this formulation that people choose the option that maximizes the prospect. The prospect V is defined by this formula. And it has some ingredients. One ingredient is that they distinguish objective probability Pj and subjective probability Wpj. So this probability weighting function W converts the objective probability into a subjective probability. And this nonlinear function is characterized by typically by inverse S-shaped nonlinearity, so that people tend to overestimate small probability and tend to underestimate large probability. That's what the model assumes. And this V is so-called the value function, which converts monetary outcome xj into the prospect. And the functional form is described here. It has a concave shape in the gain domain, and it has a convex shape in the loss domain. And relatively speaking, the loss part, negative part, is magnified by some factor k greater than 1 with respect to this positive part. This k factor is called loss aversion factor. So the detail of the functional form is not so important, but sometimes people use a power function like x to the power of r to describe this function. And the third factor is so-called the reference point with which the monetary gain is measured. And sometimes theta equals 0 works, which means just the gain is measured with respect to your current asset. That's an easy reference point. But unfortunately, it's in some problems, it's known that theta equals 0 reference point doesn't work. So in that case, this reference point must be adjusted to account for people's behavior. But anyhow, these are the basic ingredients of the prospect theory. And let me explain to you how this model explains people's risk preference. In the gain domain, the model uses concave V function. And this basically explains risk aversion. It's simply because if you compare probabilistic outcomes, perhaps here and here, probabilistically, and the linearly interpolating these two possible outcomes gives this value down here, whereas the value of receiving the average amount gives the higher value up here. So a certain outcome with the same expected value is more attractive than a probabilistic outcome. So this explains basic risk aversion property. And the remaining question is how this model explains the preference for gambling if there is such an option, gambling option. And that is explained by this probability weighting. If there is a gambling option with a low probability but gaining a lot of money, then people overestimate such a probability of winning the lottery and prefer taking the risk-seeking option. So that's the basic mechanism how the prospect theory explains people's behavior. And it's just the opposite for the loss domain. In the loss domain, instead of concave, convex function is used. So that's basically reproducing risk-seeking behavior. And also for the small probability event, people overemphasize small probability disastrous event. And if there is such an event, people can be risk averse. So that's the explanation by the prospect theory. And certainly this is a very famous model, prominent model. In fact, this is a Nobel Prize winning model. But it doesn't mean that the model has no problems. I just list two problems here. One is the estimated subjective probability perception by the probability weighting function varies among subjects and is highly context dependent. The model could be prone to overfitting because to fit the nonlinear function, it could use multiple parameters. The second point, the reference point is not well defined and is set case by case. The initial asset position sometimes work, but not always. So in some cases, the reference point needs to be adjusted. So even the prospect theory has some problems, and we would like to here propose an alternative mathematical model. We introduce a simple mathematical model that is inspired by neuroscience findings. So here are insights from neuroscience. The first one is that hippocampal sequential activity of neurons predicts immediate future behavior. Before an animal like rodents perform an action, hippocampal place cells or cortical cells exhibit sequence of activity in the presence of shockwave ripples. And these sequential patterns are produced, and that corresponds to possible outcome events, or often the future behavior. So the experimental result looks as if animal plans an action by anticipating possible outcome sequences. So this is one experimental finding. Another one is that reward prediction error drives dopamine neurons. And the dopamine neurons are not only important for reinforcement learning, but they are also important for action generation. And I'm sure you know the famous experiments by Schultz, where the dopamine activity is driven, well characterized by the actual reward minus the expected reward. In other words, the activity of dopamine neurons are driven by surprise. So we consider a decision-making model based on surprise encoded during sequential anticipation of possible outcome. So here, the surprise model that we propose in the simplest form. The model suggests that people choose the option that maximizes the surprise value, which is described by this capital delta. And this is the formula. Pj is the objective probability, and Sj is sort of the error. The error is described by the actual outcome, monetary outcome, minus the expected outcome. And this function, nonlinear function delta, converts this error by using this kind of functional form. If you look at the parameterization is exactly the same as the value function for the prospect theory. It's a power function, both for the gain and the loss domain, where with the amplification K factor applied for the negative part. But the convexity is the opposite. So we use a convex function for the positive error and the concave function for the negative error. So this nonlinear function amplifies a highly surprising event, say those salient events, and sort of amplify them more than events with a small surprise. Okay, so in summary, the difference from the prospect theory is one difference is that it does not assume nonlinear probability weighting. In other words, we are just using the objective probability Pj. It uses the well-defined expected outcome as the reference point. So the reference point is well-defined, it's the expected outcome. Third, we use a convex surprise function for the positive error and concave surprise function for the negative error. So the model is arguably simpler than the prospect theory because we don't use nonlinear probability weighting. We have a well-defined reference point. So it's a simpler model with a less number of parameters. And we see how the proposed surprise model can account for a less example. So here we computed the surprise value delta as a function of reward probability P. And we plotted that for the gain domain and the loss domain. Certainly, the shape of the curve depends on detailed parameters like loss aversion factor K or the detailed functional form for the convex function. But the qualitative feature of this curve is robust. And it has the following property. So when the reward probability P is 1, it's a certain option, and there is no surprise. So the surprise value is 0. But when the rewarding probability get reduced a little bit, around here, the surprise value declines. Which means that the model predicts risk aversion at the relatively high reward probability. Around here, with a much less reward probability, actually, the curve starts to increase, and the value is high. This means that the model predicts risk-seeking behavior because the value here, up here, is better than a certain reward. And the model also reproduces the mirror effect. Note that qualitatively speaking, the curve for the loss domain is flipped by the mirror, so that at the higher punishment probability, model predicts risk-seeking, and at the lower punishment probability, it predicts risk aversion, consistent with the experimental observation. So both the prospect theory and our model get these basic features correct, but by very different mechanisms. And I will explain the mechanism by which the surprise model explains this. So let's first talk about the parameter around here, where reward probability is reasonably high. And around here, the subject is assuming probable reward here. And by assuming probable reward, getting reward is not that surprising. But if you receive no reward, that's surprising and disappointing. And this disappointing event is amplified by the nonlinear function. So this nonlinear amplification reduces the value of this option, and which leads to risk aversion. What happens down there with a lower reward probability? Around here, subject assumes improbable reward. And if you assume improbable reward, getting reward is surprising, pleasant surprise. And this surprise is amplified by the nonlinear function and increases the surprise value and leads to risk-seeking behavior. And the explanation for the loss domain is just a mirror flip, assuming probable punishment and getting no punishment is surprising and increasing the value for and which leads to risk-seeking behavior. If you assume improbable punishment and get punishment, it's a terrible surprise, and which leads to risk aversion. So for this simple model, the model predictions are rather similar to prospect theories one predictions, but the mechanisms are different. So what about more complex decisions, or more realistic decisions? So next we talk about a more complex decision-making scenario that involves multiple stages, or in this example, 2 stages. And actually, this is the example taken from the Kahneman-Tversky's prospect theory paper. So let me introduce you these options. So for this option 1, here's the starting point. And with a 75% probability, you get nothing and the game ends. But with a 25% probability, you proceed to the second stage. At the second stage, you have 80% chance of getting 4,000 or 20% chance of not getting nothing. The option 2 has the same first stage as option 1, but at the second stage, you have a certain gain of 3,000. And experimentally, it's known that people prefer option 2. And the question is how the prospect theory explains this preference for option 2. Basically, how the prospect theory tackles this problem is by collapsing multi-stage problem into a corresponding single-stage problem. Then the question is how exactly the conversion happens. Actually, a naive conversion doesn't work. If you want to naively convert these options to a single stage problem, maybe you think about just computing the probability of getting 4,000 reward. What's the probability of getting 4,000 reward? It's a 0.8 times 0.25, or it's a 1/4 of 0.8, which is 20%. What's the probability in the option 2 of getting 3,000? It's 25%. So you get 3,000 with 25%. So remember, if you just naively convert that, this is the gain domain with reward, but rather low reward probability. And in this case, people gamble and go for high risk, high return option and go for this one. And that's different from the people's preference of option 2, seeking to get 3,000. So the naive conversion doesn't work. Instead, the prospect theory suggests that people neglect the common first stage. Again, the first stage is common for both options, and if people neglect the first stage, just look at the second stage. This is the comparison of high probability, the sure gain versus more uncertain high risk, high return gain. And at high probability, people are risk averse. So it can predict that people prefers a sure gain of option 2 if the first stage is neglected. So in order to convert, regarding how to convert these two-stage problems into single-stage problem, the prospect theory prepares editing rules. And I just read those editing rules. Number 1, set the reference point by deciphering the expectation of the subjects. This is already a bit ambiguous, how to set the reference point. But I just go on. The second rule is the combine identical outcomes. Third, subtract riskless components. And fourth, discard common components, such as the common first stage. So in this case, if you apply the rule number 4, you get the correct answer. But there are already some criticism that the prediction depends on which rules are invoked or the order of in which they are applied. And there is some ambiguity non-uniqueness in the prediction. For example, for this problem, you might think of applying the rule number 2 and combine identical outcomes, because here's an identical outcome here and there. You might consider combining these identical outcomes. Then the prediction would be different. So, applying this editing rules is not straightforward. So let's see how the surprise model that we propose can explain this kind of two-stage problems. So next I will talk about applying the surprise model to multi-stage problems and say that no editing rule is required. So let's think about the general two-stage problems with such a structure. Here is the starting point with the expected value E, and the P1 is the first transition probability, first stage transition probability, and this is an intermediate state with the expected value E1, and this is the second stage transition probability P11, and here's one possible outcome X11. And we propose to use the total value, which sum up the contribution of surprise arising in each transition stages. So this blue part is a surprise that arises from the stage 1 transition. This gray part is the surprise that arises from the stage 2 transition. For this stage 1, it's simple. You multiply the transition probability P1, for example, and within the delta this nonlinear function delta, you compare the expected value before the transition E and after the transition EI. So this is the difference in the expected value before and after the transition. So this is the surprise from the first transition. This is the surprise from the second transition. Again, it's a multiplication of probability P11, for example. And inside this nonlinear function, you compare transition before, expected value before the transition EI, and after the transition, the actual outcome. If we assume this, it straightforwardly neglects the common first stage, because if two options have the same common first stage, this term is the same for both options, and the choice is determined based on this part of the surprise from the second transition. And because of that, the model can straightforwardly explain the two-stage problem that I introduced to you in this previous slide. And it's easy to generalize our formalism to multi-stage problems that involve 3 or more steps. The general surprise value delta is computed by taking the expectation over possible anticipation sequences, state trajectory X, and the surprise from the different steps must be summed. And inside this nonlinear function delta, you compare the expected value before the transition, E at time t, and after the transition, E at t+1. So the value is straightforwardly applicable to more general problems. Okay, so this is the formalism. And the surprise model can explain people's empirical decisions that other prominent models cannot. So I would like to give some examples of such multi-state decisions. And because of the interest of the time, I cannot explain all the details of the calculations. But instead, I would like to explain to you for what kind of problems the surprise model is applicable, and what is the predicted key features that biases that could bias people's decision. So the first example is the blackjack gambling problem. And we consider a special case where the player has a hand 16 and the dealer has 10. At this special condition, the player has two choices. One is to stand, having no extra card, taking no extra card. The other option is hitting, getting another card. If you stand, the outcome is entirely up to the dealer's side. Dealer has to take new cards until the dealer reaches 16. So simply the outcome is based on whether dealer busted. If the dealer busted, you win. If the dealer not busted, you lose. Right? So that's the case when you choose to stand. But when you choose to hit, the first stage depends on whether the player busted with the extra card. In that case, it's you lose. And if you're not busted, then it depends on each other's hand. If the dealer's hand is not greater, you win. If the dealer's hand is greater, you lose. So what's interesting about this condition is that optimally, this hitting choice has a slightly better expected outcome. But even experienced gamblers tend to choose this standing option, this suboptimal option. So this is a paradox. And the model can account for why even experienced gamblers choose this suboptimal choice of standing. And intuitively speaking, compared to the initial stage here, if the player is not busted after hitting, the player's expectation increases. So at this intermediate state, player's expectation is high. And if the player anticipates the dealer's hand might be larger than you, that's a disappointing consequence with a big negative surprise. This big negative surprise is amplified by the nonlinear function and reduce the value of this hitting option. This is why the model predicts that the standing option is more attractive. And the result is rather robust to the parameters. It holds for k value greater than 1 and for arbitrary convex nonlinearity. So this is example 1. Let me talk about the second example. It's again the blackjack gambling, but it's about taking side bets. Side bet is a kind of insurance against a bad situation that dealer gets the blackjack. So if you take the side bets by paying the premium and the dealer has a blackjack, the premium is back. So that means you don't lose anything or you don't gain anything. The outcome is 0. But in other cases, you have to pay the premium for taking the side bet. And if you don't take the side bet, it's a standard game. The interesting thing is that the player tends to take the side bet insurance, even if the player's hand is rather good. So why, if you have a good hand, why do you take insurance? That's the question. And the model answers that by basically computing the value function. But if you just look at this second stage, the second stage has the common structure. And the only difference is that the constant premium amount is subtracted from both outcomes down here. But the theoretical prediction of the model is that the surprise function is invariant to the constant subtraction, because the surprise is relative to the baseline, and it's invariant to the constant subtraction. So this red branches are basically the same between two options. So the decision is just based on the first stage. And if you compare the first stage, this is the situation. So we assume that the player's hand is rather good. So initially, the expectation is high. Expectation for winning is high. And if you anticipate a possible loss by dealer getting the blackjack, that's a big negative disappointment. And again, the nonlinear function amplifies this disappointment and reduces the value of not taking side bet. So that explains why people might prefer taking side bets. The third example is the Elsberg paradox of two urns. So there are two urns, and two urns contain red and black balls. Urn A has a known composition of 1-to-1 ratio, like this. And urn B has an unknown ratio. We don't know the ratio of red and black balls. And interestingly, people avoid choosing urn B, this uncertain urn, regardless of red or black balls being rewarded. Regardless of the winning color, people still choose this transparent option. Why this is the case? We assume that this problem can be converted into a two-stage problem. So we assume that the variation of the choice of the urn B involves two-stage anticipation. And the first stage is by guessing the unknown ratio of the balls, red versus black. That's the first stage. And the second stage is anticipate the actual color of the ball based on the guess of the first stage. So this is called the compound lottery. First, assume the ratio and then anticipate the color based on that assumption. And once you formulate the problem in that way, it's straightforward to calculate the value function. You can just compute it, and this ambiguity of aversion is reproduced except in the small parameter regime around the power exponent 2. So for almost, for a diverse parameter range of the power index, the urn A is more attractive than this urn B, consistent with this experiment. So let me introduce the final example, Birnbaum's problem. This is a final example, and this example is introduced as a counter example of the prospect theory. Basically, the prospect theory says that outcomes, the same outcomes, can be combined. So in order to test that, this problems has some outcomes that leads to the same reward. So whether you get white ball or blue ball, you get the same outcome of 50. And here too, regardless of the color black or yellow, you get the same reward 100. So that and this problem one with that involves multiple same outcomes, same rewards, is compared with this problem two. This problem two basically combines the same rewards. So there are 250 entries here, but they are combined in the problem two, and the probability is just sum of this 10% plus 5%. So the same reward outcome is combined here. The same here. There are two 100 entries, but they are combined, and the probability for these two are summed up into 95%. So by the definition, the prospect theory and its variants cannot account for the empirical fact that people choose option two for the problem one and option one for problem two. Empirically, people's choice depends on this combining the same reward outcomes. But it cannot be accounted for by the prospect theory. How our model explains this? The surprise model can explain these experiments if delta is mildly convex and if improbable outcomes are segregated and evaluated at the second stage. So here, I'm almost finishing, but here the key point is that we first prioritize thinking major outcomes, more probable outcomes, and only later evaluate minor outcomes that are unlikely happening. And according to that, we can convert this problem into, again, two-stage problems. And in the first stage, we assume that the model evaluates a probable outcome, like in this case, 85% probability one. And then at the second stage, anticipate minor possibilities, 10% possibility, 5% possibilities. The same for option two. 80% dominant option is first anticipated, and only at the second stage, minor options are anticipated. So by doing this segregation of minor events into second branches, you can separate the same outcome into the first branch and the second branch. And this changes the variation of the value. And in particular, there is a big negative surprise in the option one when considering this improbable outcome. But that effect is milder in the option two when the same outcome is split into the first branch and second branch. And because of this segregation effect, there is a reasonable parameter range found according to the model, where the model suggests people taking option two for the problem one and option one for the problem two. So if the nonlinearity is not so steep and if the loss aversion is not that strong, then the model cannot account for that. Here's a summary. We introduced a decision-making model based on anticipated surprise. It assumes the reference point being the expected value of the outcomes. The surprise function is convex in the gain domain and concave in the loss domain. And the general bias toward risk aversion is assumed. And the model does not rely on probability weighting, nonlinear probability weighting or editing rules, and has well-defined reference point. And it is more straightforwardly applicable to multi-stage problems. The models accounts for several empirical decision-making behaviors of people, including blackjack gambling, Elsberg Paradox, of ambiguity aversion, and Birnbaum's problem, which the prospect theory and its variants cannot explain. It predicts salient surprise events that can bias people's decision. The model predicts that decisions are made by integrating surprises through the anticipated sequence of events, where the large surprise makes salient contribution. Such anticipation may encode possible behavioral sequences as they are, or more generally, it can encode cognitive processes for assessing outcomes, such as branching by introducing conditions. What happens if this is the case, like Elsberg's paradox, or segregating improbable outcomes. Like I first think about more probable events and set aside improbable events for later evaluation, like Birnbaum's problem. And so identifying and perturbing such surprise may become possible in the future. Last but not least, I would like to thank my collaborator, Hoka-chan, who did all the important works, and I also thank the funding agencies.